Sean is associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Ohio State University. Sean, the floor is yours.
Saudi, thank you so much for the introduction and for the opportunity to come spend a month here in Paris at this lovely institute. I'm an ecological anthropologist. I'm from Ohio State University, and for the past 20 years, I've been studying swidden agriculture. Most recently, I was supported by a career grant for the United States National Science Foundation, and I'm so grateful for this opportunity, for this writing fellowship here, because it's provided me an opportunity to step back and synthesize my research and think about how it relates to the intellectual history of some of the renowned scholars who have written about Swidden. These include people like Harold Conklin, Clifford Geertz, Esther Bosrup, Michael Dove, William Ballet, and James Scott. Even Carl Linnaeus studied swidden in subarctic Sweden in the 18th century. Swidden is a widely practiced form of cultivation that involves clearing small fields using rudimentary tools like axes and machetes. After clearing, fallen trees and brush are typically left to dry for 3 to 6 months when they're set on fire, releasing a burst of carbon into the soil, which amends it and increases fertility. Farmers plant and harvest crops for 1 or 2 seasons, and then they shift to new locations while the disturbed forests and soils recover, leading to a cycle of active, fallow, and regrowing fields and secondary forest. Done correctly, this can result in a sustainable rotational system. Swidden has been practiced in human societies for 10,000 years, and tens of millions of people currently use it in more than 40 countries worldwide. Yet many people have a visceral reaction to the sight of burning forests, the blankets of smoke that can hang over cities for months, and the risk of out-of-control forest fires that are increasing yearly due to climate change. Clearly, understanding the social and environmental dynamics of Swidden is key for addressing climate change and for supporting indigenous land rights. Swidden has been investigated for over a century, and yet today many of the models that have been developed rely on linear and deterministic assumptions or small, fine-grained data sets that are hard to generalize. The primary goal of my career project and the work of my students in the Human Complexity Lab at The Ohio State University has been to develop a coherent framework for Swidden using key concepts from complex adaptive systems theory that I believe may help explain its integrated human and natural dynamics. Of course, like most theory, this is not an entirely new idea. In 1957, the Indonesian agronomist Compto Utama claimed that swidden farming is a system in which a natural forest is transformed into a harvestable forest. In this 2015 image from Belize, we can see an illustration of a harvestable forest. This image raises a question that anthropologist Clifford Geertz first asked in 1967. What makes Swidden work? In other words, what do we know about the social and ecological dynamics of Swidden? And given that this question was asked over 50 years ago, we might now also inquire, have we answered it? I would suggest that, well, we know quite a lot about the individual components of Swidden: labor reciprocity, traditional ecological knowledge, local leadership, cooperation, belief systems, and even ontologies. However, we know a lot less about how they interact. In other words, we don't have very good models that account for the full complexity of this coupled human-natural system, and we know very little about which interactions are critical for forming patterns at the landscape scale. As an interdisciplinary ecological anthropologist, I've published a variety of papers on the historical background and social context of my study area in Belize, including participant observation, life history interviews, and an archival research. Today, I'm going to focus on more recent research, which is a bit more quantitative. One of the characteristic features of Swidden agriculture is the distinctive fractal-like spatial pattern in the forest canopy. When patterns like this are observed in physical, environmental, or coupled human and natural systems, they can indicate underlying self-organizing dynamics. One way to explore whether this holds for Swidden mosaics is to see if there's a power law pattern in the distribution of fields. In case you're not familiar with power law models, I won't dwell on the mathematics here and for sake of time, but I will highlight a couple of key points that can help interpret the statistical results that I'll present here in a moment. First, in this study, we've defined a swidden patch as a spatially contiguous clearing of the same fallow class. That is to say, the patch has been regrowing from a cleared state for the same number of years. This patch could be composed of one or more agricultural fields. In our model, the probability of observing a random swidden patch of a given size is proportional to the size of that patch raised to some scaling exponent, which we call alpha. That's the math. Here's the key to understanding and interpreting that alpha statistic. They typically range between 1 and 2, where alpha values around 1 indicate what's called linear scaling. This means, in this context, that large swidden patches are common. When alpha values are around 2, it indicates superlinear scaling, which means that large patches are rare. This is the important idea here is that unlike the normal distribution that you may have learned about in an introductory statistics class, there's no typical or average patch size. The landscape is dominated by a range of patch sizes, and the hypothesis is that this spatial diversity of swidden patches is ecologically and economically meaningful for swidden systems. With this model in mind, we identified a sample of 18 swidden societies around the globe and downloaded and classified high-resolution remote sensing data from 2022. We then analyzed these mosaics for statistical signatures of adaptive self-organization by estimating alpha exponents for each of the study areas. We found that in 16 out of 18 of these swidden landscapes, we could not reject the power law. Scaling exponents ranged around 1, indicating linear or sublinear scaling, and this is consistent with other biophysically constrained systems. We also calculated a correlation length that indicates the degree of spatial correlation of swidden fallow classes in forest mosaics. On average, this is around 1/2 kilometer. Overall, these results indicate that self-organization may be related to the formation of these swidden mosaics. Of course, power laws are common in natural systems, and they can arise from a range of data generation processes. So to resolve this, we need a generalizable, bespoke swidden model to explain the patterns. I worked with applied mathematician and modeler Dennis Sverkoy in my lab to develop a swidden agent-based model that explores these dynamics. It includes a grid where each pixel represents the forest state, either cleared or uncleared. The rate of pixel growth is a function of the distance to the nearest forested patch, modeling seed dispersal dynamics. It has household agents that determine a desired house size, and these agents also need other agents to help them achieve their desired harvest returns. All agents draw on social norms to decide whether to provide help or not, and household harvest returns decline with swidden labor participation. Finally, the model includes a learning and copying mechanism where the most successful household strategy is copied by less successful agents. The agent-based model investigates 3 fundamental practical challenges of swidden farming and several hypotheses about generalizable socio-ecological dynamics that many small-scale swidden communities could use to address them. The elements of this model are based on my own ethnographic fieldwork and the vast ethnographic literature on swidden. Because of this, the model represents fundamental elements and dynamics in human societies, like labor reciprocity and social norms, so it should be generalizable to many contemporary swidden societies, as well as those from the ethnohistorical and archaeological literatures. First, we modeled tropical forests as large-scale, dynamic, and unpredictable ecosystems. Here, the model operationalizes concepts from landscape ecology to simulate nonlinear responses to swidden disturbance. Second, we model how households reconcile the steep demands of swidden labor with good enough harvest returns in this complex, nonlinear forest ecosystem. Here, we incorporate ideas about customary ecological knowledge and swidden site selection. Third, we model a common property resource management dilemma that includes a mechanism for normative reasoning that can help explain how social norms related to labor exchange and land use can help small communities from depleting community forests without institutional modeling. Let me very briefly describe each of these submodels. First, we model the forest as a nonlinear system that can benefit from some degree of disturbance. The ecological submodel is governed by ecological facilitation that includes 2 factors, seed dispersal and competition for germination. This means that swidden clearings can marginally enhance ecosystem services such as biomass recovery rates and biodiversity when they create an intermediate scale of disturbance. So the question is, how do farmers figure out the right scale of disturbance and how to clear their farms without top-down planning and coordination? This brings me to the second submodel. Michael Dove noted that the importance of bird divination in randomizing swidden site selection among Bantu horticulturalists in Borneo. This was fieldwork he did in the 1970s. In the agent-based model, we model whether swidden sites are placed adjacent to an existing field or at a new random location away from other fields, what we call swidden site synchronization. Each year, a swidden household chooses a new field location, either adjacent or synchronized with the previous site, or at a new unconnected, unsynchronized location. So, for example, in this figure, in year one, here, synchronized placement links new fields to a pre-existing one, gradually expanding the contiguous patch and increasing the spatial scale of disturbance with respect to local seed dispersal dynamics. In year two, unsynchronized placement scatters the fields across the landscape, this breaks up patch growth and reduces localized disturbance. These dynamics mean that spatial cascades can occur when a new synchronized field bridges two existing previously separate patches, creating a large, suddenly creating a large merged patch. You can see this here in year three in the panel. These cascades are self-limiting. Large merged patches restrict adjacent clearings, and if you measure the distribution of the full patch, they produce, and measure that distribution, they produce power law distributions similar to pair box sampile or forest fire models in physics. And as we saw in the remote sensing data from the 18 swidden societies we analyzed in this study. This is the quantitative signature that we think may indicate adaptive self-organization in swidden agriculture. Last, we model normative reasoning. Swidden forests are usually common properties, and cultivation is labor-intensive. It requires help from friends and family for clearing and planting tasks, and social networks and social norms can mediate the amount of work that gets done, and therefore the amount of common forest resources that are used. This is illustrated here. In the top panel, you can see when a farmer tries to cultivate a reasonable harvest, he gets lots of helpers, and he achieves his desired harvest level with a smaller amount of land. But in the bottom panel, you have a larger request, and fewer people show up, and an even smaller amount gets done, and the resulting harvest is smaller. The process of deciding whether to provide labor based on the amount or size of a request is what we refer to as normative reasoning. Normative reasoning is also an example of what Eleanor Ostrom defined as graduated sanctioning, which is a system for punishing defectors that scales with the severity of the violation. In previous research, we ran framed public goods games in Belize and found that the more environmentally conservative outcomes correlated with a higher graduated sanctioning index, while more extractive games had less sanctioning. We use the model I described above to simulate the effects of social norms related to normative reasoning on ecosystem outcomes and adaptive self-organization. In the sustainable swidden regime, which you can see here in red, yellow, and purple, we see scaling dynamics and slightly sublinear alpha estimates, while the unsustainable deforestation regime in blue does not exhibit a power law. We also ran simulations at different levels of swidden disturbance. In the top two panels here, we show how harvest levels and biomass recovery peak at an intermediate level of disturbance. And this compared positively with a fragmentation analysis conducted by Dr. Shane Skaggs in my lab of the swidden disturbance patterns in the same remote sensing data that we analyzed above. It shows vegetation diversity peaking at intermediate levels. What's interesting about this result is that you can see the highest biomass and crop productivity levels is also at a bifurcation point. In other words, when the ecosystem is disturbed, it becomes more susceptible to large-scale collapse. Finally, we compared the model to the remote sensing data. Here we're looking at the high-intensity swidden regime in red compared to the remote sensing data from Belize in blue, and you can see that both follow power laws with comparable scaling exponents. All of the sites are plotted here in the inset. In this figure, we also plotted in green self-reported swidden field sizes from a household survey that I conducted in 2018. This sample doesn't include spatial information, so it gives us a way of looking at what a distribution of unsynchronized swidden fields would look like. And clearly, it doesn't follow a power law. This empirical support tells us that the synchronization mechanism in the model really is the key to adaptive self-organization in swidden systems. So the question is, how does the system maintain itself in this delicate balancing point between productivity and collapse? The answer is adaptive self-organization. In the model, this occurs because of feedback between social norms related to labor provision, field placement strategies, and the degree of disturbance in the environment. Information about the state of the environment passes to farmers through the harvest level, which farmers use to adapt their strategies by copying from more successful farmers. These dynamics can help farmers maintain the ecosystem at an intermediate disturbed state that encourages ecosystem services like biomass productivity and biodiversity and good harvests. As I noted in my introduction, my time here at the Institute of Advanced Study in Paris is a wonderful opportunity to synthesize the quantitative work that I've just discussed and the more qualitative and ethnographic and historical work that I've not had time to discuss, and to think about how it relates to the vast literature on swidden systems. A couple years ago, I read a paper by philosopher Matthew Barker and biologist Dylan Fraser that identified a pattern of logical inconsistencies in conservation literature, which occurs when values and empiricism are conflated in scientific arguments. To help diagnose it, they defined an unraveled rope problem. They wrote, just as strands of a rope must be properly and intricately wound with each other so that the rope supports its load, empirical aspects and value aspects of an argument must relate intricately and properly if the argument is to support its conclusion. They defined 6 families of argument defects that can indicate the unraveled rope problem. For example, value unclarity due to language occurs when the use of value-laden content of an argument's premise includes ambiguous or vague language, which prevents the argument from providing valid support for its conclusions by confusing the logical structure. I suspect that this applies to the swidden literature because there are a large number of distinct terms that are used for the core concepts related to swidden, such as swidden cultivation, swidden agriculture, swidden farming, shifting agriculture, shifting cultivation, and slash and burn. Probably you've heard a few of these. Each of these terms has a distinct etymology and definition, and each also implies a different meaning and set of values. So my goal for my writing fellowship this month is to investigate whether the unraveled rope problem characterizes the literature on swidden agriculture. I recently conducted a Web of Science search and identified no fewer than 27,894 papers on swidden agriculture. So broadly stated, I have 2 research questions that I'm working on here. First, does the unraveled rope problem affect swidden studies? And if so, how? And second, is adaptive self-organization just a different type of model for swidden, or does it help overcome any of the structural limitations of the science itself? So with that, I would like to close and thank you for listening. I wanted to extend my appreciation one more time to Saadi and to the staff and faculty here at the Institute for inviting me and hosting me. I'd also like to thank my collaborators on all the papers that I just presented in the last 20 minutes, my co-authors, and of course, my funders. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Sean. This is spectacular. And do we now have some questions or suggestions from our colleagues in the audience? And while you're thinking, I'd like to ask you my question, Sean. Actually, I've got one question and one comment. My question is that it was unclear to me if these farmers are using these plots of land as commons, or is that individual fields, and then they ask for help only for the moment of I mean cropping or something like that. And my comment is that I really like what you're doing, because in fact science is understanding the mechanisms, right? And so all this quantitative approach is a way to check what you will have found in terms of mechanism and demonstrate it in a way. And I was wondering if you could get some cues of what actually are the heuristics of the farmers to decide what they're doing in terms of site, or and because you've been talking about Borneo of some techniques that look like magic, right? But are there other things like I don't know how grown are the trees in the plot that they're gonna because of course when you have big trees there's less more shade and less productivity, and do they have some kind of heuristics that could actually help you in understanding the mechanisms?
Thanks very much for the question and for the comment. I'll start with the question. You're spot on in asking about common property. All of those swidden societies in our sample, we did a literature review, and one of the criteria for including one of those sites was some kind of documentation that the communal forest was managed as a common property. Of course, that's going to vary country to country to country. You know, in some places, perhaps these communities have legal communal land rights, as in Belize. In other places, they're probably considered squatters by the government as formal legal definition. But what matters is actually how the land is actually used by the community. And in all of these cases, that has to be effectively a common property, if not legally a common property. So that's a key distinction here. Under a private property regime, swidden, for all intents and purposes, can't work because the properties are too small. I mean, unless they were giant or something. So common property is key for sure. So in terms of cues, I presented a lot of mathematical modeling and remote sensing stuff. All of this started with basic participant observation. Me, sort of going to the village. I have the sort of the classic story of, being paddled across the river and showing up, sort of the anthropologist origin story. But that's where it started. And so, sort of the qualitative participant observation, that ethnographic research is really where you, I think, collect information about those cues. And so it's quite confusing in the beginning because you're asking people, and they're normative behaviors that aren't really operationalized. You ask them and they kind of look at you and say, well, of course, this is just how we do it. And so it just takes persistence and just kind of watching and following people around, going out farming. And I started to realize that there are certain farmers that are better farmers than others, and people copy their behaviors where they go in the forest. And then you start to ask, well, why do they go there and not there? And so ultimately, when I finally had the opportunity to work with an applied mathematician modeler, we could formalize that sort of here and not there as a binary rule or a probability of synchronization or desynchronization in a model. So I think that the ethnography has a lot of those kinds of the ethnography is the source for the rules that we were very strategic about putting into the model. And for the modelers out there, this is a parsimonious model. It's not a real world model, so we tried to minimize the number of parameters. Certainly Michael Dove's ethnography was wonderful to read because he's talking about, farmers in Indonesia that are kind of looking up at the sky and seeing where the birds go as a way of like choosing where to put the next field. And so it was a very, very different mechanism that we were able to model with the same actual mechanism in our model. So it doesn't, the ethnography kind of it shows you that it can instantiate in different kinds of ways, but serve the same sort of effect of synchronization and desynchronization. So thank you for those fantastic questions, Sadi.
Thank you, Sean. Siddharth, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. So first off, Sean, I never thought I, as a computer scientist, would have anything to say to an ecological anthropologist ever in my life. But it turns out, um, um, by happenstance, we've studied a lot of the same things: cooperation, norms, complexity. I've even done ethnography as well. Super cool work. I look forward to hearing more about it over lunch as the days come by. Um, you said something really cool during your talk. You said many cool things. I want to be clear, but there was one thing that really struck me, and that was you said this made this point about how cooperation, norms, the ecosystem all sort of intersect. And there's a stack of papers in the social sciences on cooperation, 1,000 meters high. There's a stack of papers about norms, 1,000 meters high. There's a stack of papers on ecosystems, 1,000 meters high. How these intersect is something that I have not heard many scholars talk about. Is that something you've written about? Or is that something you plan to write about this month? Because that seems super cool, super compelling, and super impactful.
Well, thank you so much. It was super hard, I'll be honest.
Yeah, it is.
You
It
know,
is.
it's and I don't want to overstate it in any way. It was the original idea when I started fieldwork back 20 years ago, literally in Belize. I wanted to go into this particular kind of system. Um, and try to observe it and see if I could understand the intersection between social norms and ecosystem dynamics. And that's a hard thing to do because it's an inherently interdisciplinary question. I'm not an ecologist. I am a social scientist. But we all have our the breadths of our knowledge. And
Mhm.
so the disciplinary silos often get in the way of understanding.
Mhm.
And I think it's just taken some persistence and perseverance. And effectively what I did, I built it into my introduction, and I meant it seriously. Like, what I've done is I've published a series of different papers that are, basically puzzle pieces. That's how I think about them. They're very discrete and
Yeah,
diverse, disciplinarily diverse in ethnohistory and
yeah,
landscape ecology, in math modeling, and
yeah,
these
yeah,
aren't, and so this is the opportunity to start bringing things together. The paper that I had
yeah. The
the
PNAS paper.
PNAS paper, which is in
Yeah.
press right now, is that's the capstone paper for that career grant, and the sort of the technical explanation of the integration of the social dynamics and the ecological dynamics, the remote sensing data for validation, and the agent-based modeling
Mhm.
for the mechanisms. So that's the whole picture. And what I'm trying to do here is to tell that story more clearly, really. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
it's a technical
yeah,
sciencey paper, and
yeah,
I'm working on the story, the scientific communication. I think
yeah,
I was talking about this with a couple people at lunch, like,
yeah,
that oftentimes I think that's a totally different kind of challenge than doing the science itself. But that's how I would respond.
yeah. Cool. Um, yeah, that sounds very, very compelling. Nobody writes that paper. You know what I mean? It's all just buried in jargon and math, and no one writes the common sense version of how these things intersect. So I'm looking forward to hearing about it.
Thanks so much, Andy.
Thanks, Sean. Really interesting. In one of your slides, you had quite a lot of countries in the world practicing swidden. Uh, what would you say is specific about swidden in Belize? Either that you expected to find before your research or that you found out during the research?
Well, what brought me to Belize initially was visible in Google imagery. If you look down, and I showed, one of those images in the sort of initial provocation in this talk, this thing that pops out at you. It's those mosaics are pretty clear. There's you look at those forest mosaics, and there's something interesting going on there. If you would look just across the border, and I actually I didn't zoom out on that image in the PowerPoint, but if you were to, you'd see the Guatemalan border, and on the other side of the border in the Petén, it's a devastated landscape from cattle ranching. It's just all transformed, and so Belize, and this is not to reify the communities or Belize in any way, but for historical reasons, the forest was not devastated due to cattle ranching when I began my research. And so there was a spatial signature of the phenomenon that I was interested in there. That was the sort of the ecological side. On the social side, the indigenous communities in southern Belize, were involved in a very difficult process, starting in the 1990s of securing. This is back to Sadi's question, legal land tenure for the community, not for the individual. And so they've actually been quite successful over the past 20 years in legal cases that are supported by international attorneys, that have advocated for them. And they've secured actual legal land tenure around the villages for community lands. And so it's an interesting place to sort of study these dynamics. It's important not to reify this. These are not communities that are isolated from the world. They're active and engaged in many, many, many ways. And so that's important, I think. These are not outliers in Belize. I think that's what I found. That combination of attributes I found important.
Thank you so much, Sean. Is there any more question now, or do you want to have a 5 minutes break before we listen to Christopher? Okay, thank you again, Sean, and we'll have a lot of fascinating discussions. And yeah.
Thanks so much.